So I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm the founder of the Transparency Task Force. The Transparency Task Force, or TTF, is a certified social enterprise. We're based in the UK, but we have people who have an interest in our work in 20 countries around the world. The TTF started off its life focused on things like the lack of transparency on costs and charges and investments, things that frankly now seem pretty minor and trivial. They're not minor and they're not trivial, but compared to what we're finding ourselves dealing with now on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, they really do seem to be. Because as time has gone by, we've gradually morphed from being an organization focused on improving the way the financial sector operates and how the companies work to becoming more and more of something akin to an anti-corruption organization. Corruption's a very strong word, and I'm aware it has legal connotations. But that general theme of collusion, corruption, and accompanying cover-up, these are themes that seem to be coming up in much of the work that we are doing. And they seem to be things that we just can't get away from because all the time we find ourselves raising awareness of issues relating to the kind of malpractice, malfeasance, misconduct, mis-selling that most definitely is going on within the financial sector. We're also realizing that the hierarchy of establishment, if you like, the governance framework that's supposed to be there, governance framework involving organizations such as the Financial Conduct Authority, the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, the Financial Ombudsman Service, City of London Police, the Fraud Squad, the National Crime Agency, Action Fraud, etc., etc., etc. To be very blunt about it and very bold about it, none of it seems to be working. None of it seems to be working. And that's why over the last few years, we've run a couple of events with the general theme of state capture. And state capture sounds like the kind of thing that a conspiracy theorist would be interested in. But state capture is actually about the general idea of the institutions in a country systemically failing. And to be very frank with you, I am increasingly identifying with that. And the reason I am increasingly identifying with it is because we are seeing more and more evidence that there is a collapse in the standards of conduct that one would expect. Things like the 7 principles of public life, or the Nolan principles, as they're sometimes called. To my mind, that they used to be things that were taken seriously. Today, people don't seem to resign when they should if they've done something wrong. Today, politicians and others do things that once upon a time just weren't accepted or expected. And in so many ways, Duncan's book chimes into this theme that things are happening that aren't really right and really aren't acceptable. And I think the book, from what I know of it, does a really good job of kind of taking us right to that interface between two very interesting things. You know, what is right and what is lawful? Something can, of course, be lawful, even though it's completely wrong. And I guess there's a moral judgment in there. I think what Duncan's written about is remarkably important, both because of what has happened, but also, and obviously, because of the people involved. What does it say about our government? What does it say of the way business and commerce is done? What does it say of society? And does it not add even more weight to those wonderfully wise words from Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's right-hand man? Charlie Munger often speaks about, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. And I mentioned that phrase in this context because surely what Duncan's book does is help to shine a big bright light on the idea that if people see sufficient personal gain, be that through greed or otherwise, in doing something that's essentially something they shouldn't be doing, a lot of people would take the temptation and do it. Would you, as we hear about the book, please do ask yourself that question. When thinking about the conduct of others, put yourself in the situation and have a conversation with yourself about whether you too would do it. Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. If you would, why? If you wouldn't, why? Lots of thoughts, lots of ideas, lots of things we can discuss. But first of all, can I please invite everybody to show their real appreciation to Duncan, who's got a fantastic book out there, very, very timely, of course, because of David Cameron's re-entry into the political scene. Duncan, we're really pleased to have you with us. Thank you very, very much indeed. I'm going to pass it completely over to you, Duncan. Expect me to chip in every now and then, maybe others as well. But over to you, sir, to tell us about what motivated you to write the book, what's it all about, what are the key findings, etc., etc. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate everybody listening. You actually did touch on a lot of the things that are in there, I think. And I think although this scandal occurred a couple of years ago now, it's clearly still really, really relevant. Cameron returning to office is something that shocked me, and I think anybody close to the story, because we thought he was finished as a result of his involvement in Green Cell. So his return to frontline politics, is shocking. Fortunately for the story, in a way, it kind of revives it and revives interest in it, which is also important because there are a ton of lawsuits still flying around related to Green Cell. There are criminal investigations in Switzerland and Germany. There's an SFO investigation here in the UK. There are also lawsuits involving a lot of the banks and insurers that were involved in Green Cell that involved billions and millions of dollars still, and lots of incredible details that I didn't have in my book that are coming out now about the way Green Cell operated. And then just last week, the insolvency agency was the first group to kind of pronounce on their investigation really into Green Cell, and they have asked that he be banned from being a company director for 15 years, which I think is the maximum penalty they can request. And I found that, for me, that's really, really interesting, because this is the first kind of independent body that everybody else who's weighed in so far is a bank or an insurance company or an investor, and they all have some vested interest in what they want. Usually it's to kind of preserve as much cash or get as much cash from one of the other parties involved. So this is the first time a truly sort of independent group said something and they asked for the maximum penalty. So I think that, for me, that tells you a lot. Before we got going, Andy, you asked, why did I want to write the book? So I'm going to be a little self-indulgent in explaining that, I guess. But my background was I was an accountant. After university, I joined Deloitte, worked for Deloitte and a couple of other places for the best part of 10 years. And I became a journalist when I was about 30 in Canada. The reason I switched career was partly because I wanted to write for a living. It was partly because I felt like in finance, it was a bit of a house of cards. I always felt like I am, contributing to something that I'm not sure I fully understand, and I'm not sure everyone around me fully understands either. But by the way, my last job was as a head of complex accounting for a big bank in a sort of internal audit type function. And so I was sort of motivated generally by, trying to figure out, how does this all work? What happens when things go wrong? Who's in charge? Who stops things going wrong? So, then I spent a lot of time at the Wall Street Journal. And, the Wall Street Journal does a lot of investigative stories, but ultimately it is a business newspaper, right? Its job is to cover the business world for the most part. So I think that, is a fairly balanced place. Nevertheless, in my work there, I came across this guy, Green Cell, fairly early on in his in the sort of the scandal as it became. So this was around the time that he blew up another company before Credit Suisse, before he was involved with Credit Suisse or any of the really big companies. He was involved with a big asset manager called GAM. And GAM found that Lex Greensill and one of their portfolio managers had been behaving inappropriately. And they, well, it almost brought GAM to its knees. To this day, it has never really recovered. And I couldn't really get my head around who this guy was. I'd never heard of him. You know, I was a senior editor at the Wall Street Journal. I'd never come across this guy. I asked around a lot of people, and I would say in equal measure, I got kind of responses that were, he's going to be the next big thing. And people who said, stay away from that guy. He's a disaster. It's going to blow up sooner or later. And that, you know, was how on earth can these two such wildly divergent opinions exist at once? So I really started to dig in, and my first sense of meeting with Lex only kind of, you know, made me more and more interested, because it was really clear to me that the guy was not telling me the truth. You know, he would, in pretty normal conversation, he would say things that were clearly, provably not true. And, you know, fairly minor things quite often. And I sort of thought, well, this is really odd. Like, how can a guy like this be suddenly sort of on his way to becoming a billionaire at that time? So I just kept sort of digging and digging. And of course, the thing grew up and grew, you know, got bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually blew up. You know, I felt like part of my work when I was reporting on it, I felt partly like I was a whistleblower, to be quite honest. It was so obviously wrong. And I was calling, you know, he got very involved in Credit Suisse. For anybody who knows the story a little bit, they put $10 billion of their clients' money into funds that were invested entirely in assets sourced by Greensill. And, you know, I was going to them and pointing out, like, you know, for stories, these assets aren't what you said they are. The insurance coverage isn't what you think it is. And it felt like actually the relationship I had with the bank was more that of whistleblower than of journalist, of reporter. You know, I couldn't quite understand, why do they not see this? It wasn't hard actually to uncover a lot of it. In the end, you know, to write the book, I got a lot of kind of documents, things that were helped me write it in a way that was you know, really in depth. But actually to prove that what Greensill said he was selling was not what, you know, it wasn't actually the right thing, that wasn't very difficult at all. It was actually really simple. It was like Google, you know, pick the companies that they said they've loaned money to, Google them, pull the documents off Companies House, and there it is, you know, 20 million quid to a company that has no assets, no cash flow, no revenue. And so, you know, and then go to Credit Suisse and say, here you are, you know, I've got a list of 20 of these. This guy's loaned all your clients' money to them. How's it going to come back? And it was kind of staggering to me that they sort of didn't seem to know, didn't seem to care. Just, you know, it just kept, so long as the money kept coming into the funds, and I guess so long as they kept getting paid, they didn't really care about it at all. Which brings me to sort of, you know, whenever I've talked about this story, and I can go into more details about how it worked and all of that stuff if you guys want to ask any questions about it. But there are two things that I always like to talk about it. One is, these sort of scams, or, you know, people think they're victimless, and they're not, you know. And if I was to write a book again, I would try and make that point even more than I made it in the book. They're definitely not victimless. You know, in the case of Greensill's collapse, there are a whole bunch of German municipalities who are owed tens of millions of euros, who put their money into a bank Greensill owned in Germany, and it's gone. And, you know, this is, I think, really resonates at a time right now where actually local councils in the UK are struggling, right? In Germany, they lost their money. There were 1,000 or so employees. Many of them had given up decent jobs, went to work for Lex Greensill, thought they were going to work for, you know, the next Google or Amazon of finance, and they're out of work. And actually, the totally crazy thing there was, after the company collapsed, Lex fought against making the redundancy payments that he legally had to make, and fought for a year not to pay out a few £1 million to employees. there is our own government. So the UK government has lost money on this. You know, there's Seabell's money and so on that went into Greensill as a result of, you know, partly of David Cameron's lobbying that has not been returned. And then the other group, which is pretty obvious really, is investors in the Credit Suisse funds. And they seem a little bit distant, you know, from what happened. But in reality, you know, there's still about $3 or $4 billion missing. So never hasn't been returned. Some of that is, you know, giant sovereign wealth funds, and it's hard to feel too much sympathy for them. But some of that is kind of people with, you know, a little bit of wealth. So there's like a guy I know, for instance, who sort of has a few $1,000,000, kind of self-made entrepreneur. His Credit Suisse banker came to him, said, put your money into these things. It's as safe as cash. He put it in. They told him, you know, you'll get even better returns if we lend you some money. So he borrowed money. Fortunately, he got some of it out before the end, but he ended up losing a few $1,000,000. You know, so these are, you know, that's a real victim, right? That's somebody who's lost money. The second thing I always like to talk about on this subject, which is sort of ancillary or adjacent to the book, is the role of all the facilitators. So when you're sort of digging into a story like this, it becomes really clear how many people don't want you to tell the truth. So in this particular case, I sat on phone calls with lawyers at top London law firms who flat out lied to me. And that's pretty rare. As a financial journalist, I come across PR people. In fact, my wife's a PR person, and who will try and spin stories a certain way. You know, they'll try and give you the positive emphasis. But it's quite rare that people lie. I find, you know, flat out lie to your face. It happens every now and again, but not that often. But I sat and talked to top lawyers who said things that they knew were not true, I knew were not true, and now we can prove are not true. Similarly, the accountants, you know, so we had a bunch of different accountancy firms involved in Greensill. Actually, the big ones tended to steer clear of him, the big four. I don't just say that because I worked for one of them at one point, but they generally did. You know, there's an administrator now winding up Greensill Capital who I think has a very, you know, a lot of questions to answer. And I, you know, happy to go into why I think that. The bankers clearly, you know, as I said, I presented them with all the information they needed to know to get out of this stuff. In fact, I heard today that at one point, a very senior banker at Credit Suisse, after I'd asked some questions, apparently there's a report at Credit Suisse into what happened, and apparently in there's some, I haven't seen it, but I've been told there's some emails between very senior people there saying, we need to stop Duncan Mavin asking questions. Let's call Lex Greensill and get the answers. So, you know, pretty ridiculous sort of response to a genuine attempt to get to the bottom of something that was problematic. The PR people who, you know, continued to take money from this guy, even though they all knew he was, you know, very, very problematic. I will say there were one or two who walked away, and I'm impressed that they did. And then the other group really is, and maybe these people have as much responsibility as anybody, the investors. So two big investors in Greensill Capital were, I mean, there were a lot of sort of individuals that put money in, but the two big institutional investors were SoftBank, the SoftBank Vision Fund, and, you know, they put $1.5 billion into Lex. In the end, I think they lost about $2.5 billion. But they, you know, their recklessness, the recklessness with which they put the money into Greensill Capital, you know, fueled that business. They kind of just gave him so much cash that he just couldn't stop going. And the other institution that put a lot of money in was a private equity firm called General Atlantic. And, you know, General Atlantic never want to talk about this. They got their money out. They put about $250 million in. They got their money out partly because the more foolish group from SoftBank came along afterwards and gave them enough that they could get out. But General Atlantic put $250 million in, and they never talk about this. They never talk about what they did to, you know, they fueled this guy again. So I think those are the things for me that sort of this, there are victims of things like this. And two, the sort of ecosystem that supports a Lex Green Cell is really important. And then I guess coming back to what I said earlier, the third really important thing is not to let these things drop, because Lex Green Cell has about, I'm told, $250 million. He got out of the business. He has a couple of KCs on retainer. He is fighting tooth and nail never to sort of have this, justice prevail or the truth come out. I'm very careful what I would say about him because of that, but it's pretty clear that with that sort of money you can delay and obfuscate for a very long time.
Duncan, thank you so much. You've got the ball rolling really, really nicely. I'm buzzing with comments and questions. Okay, I put a few in the chat, some of which I'll refer to now. A key question. There you were authoring this book, doing your research, exposing the truth. Did you at any time find yourself a bit worried about frankly, about what might happen to you for digging up this dirt that you were discovering so brilliantly?
Well, I thanks. Yeah, and it was I definitely did, definitely. So I
Interesting.
can give you a specific incident,
Yeah.
and then I'll tell you more generally how it felt, right? So the specific incident is, at one point I went to talk to a source. So somebody I'd known for a very long time, actually kind of got me interested in the story from the start. It sort of said to me, there's this guy Lex Greensill, you should look into him. And anyway, I'd gone to meet this source in central London for a coffee in a hotel lobby. And he gave me, he gave me a brown envelope with something in it.
Right.
It was a children's book for my kids.
Okay.
But I guess if you were watching, you wouldn't have known that. So I then went to meet my
Ah,
wife and kids in London. It was there. My two older kids have the same birthday, and we we're going out for dinner. Put my bag with this brown paper package in the boot of the car. Went off for dinner, and as we went off, my wife and I both noticed somebody hanging around the car acting odd. When you sort of have that sense of something's not quite right. But we
yeah.
just sort of ignored it. Came back 45 minutes to an hour later, and something wasn't right. I couldn't tell what it was. Something didn't look right about the car. It was all locked, and then I noticed that the parcel shelf on the back was kind of rippled. And so I opened the car, opened the boot, and my bag had gone. And to explain how weird that was, first of all, it was locked. Secondly, it was the kid's birthday, so actually there was a bunch of presents in the boot, but my bag was sort of further deeper into the car than all the presents. So anybody stealing, opportunist thief stealing some stuff would have
Yeah.
taken the bags with Selfridges and Nike on them, not the
Yeah.
gym bag that was shoved further into the car. So I immediately was pretty worried. At Dow Jones, which owned the Wall Street Journal, we had a security guy. So I called him and explained what I was working on and, that kind of thing. And he said, change all the locks on your house,
Did you really?
change your passcodes, wipe everything, new phone. Anyway, I'll fast forward to when it all broke and my sourcing got a lot better. I heard that, yep, they were following me. Yeah, they had private detectives on retainer, and I actually, now I know who it was. I know the person who did it.
Wow. Wow. That's absolutely remarkable. Um, did that make you feel scared, angry, both? What was the emotional consequence of realizing that you were being followed by people and people didn't want you to expose the truth? Because that must have felt pretty intense, not just for you, but presumably for your family as well.
Yeah. I mean, I remember at the time being really, it's the same feeling you would have if your house was burgled, just that sense of kind of being a bit
Yeah,
violated.
yeah.
You're, um, it wasn't helped by, I talked to the head of the security guy at Dow Jones, and he said, "Oh, don't worry about it. I know who these guys are. They're just a bunch of amateurs." And I thought, I'm not sure that's a good thing. I would rather be followed by the professionals than the amateurs. But so, but I say generally it led to, I felt actually more like I wanted to
Good
figure
man.
this all out. I think when the book came out, it definitely contributed to a sense I had of, you know, should we put all our, should we put the house in my wife's name kind of thing? Lex
Right.
is very litigious. Um,
Right.
in the end, I will say not one complaint, not one factual change anywhere in the book. Although I do
Remarkable.
hear Lex telling people, "Oh, it's all a load of rubbish," not true, you know. But if that was the
Mm.
case, then let's go to court. Um, so yeah, it was a worry. I mean, the other thing I would say is I think that is weirdly common, actually, the following. I'm working on a book right now about Credit Suisse, and one of their CEOs recently, 4 or 5 years ago, lost his job because of a scandal where the bank had hired spies to spy on its own executives. Um, there was an incident with SoftBank that my colleagues at the Wall Street Journal wrote up where they used a honey trap on their own staff to, figure out to be able to.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. I think they've denied it, but it's in the Wall Street Journal, and I think they denied it pretty lightly. But I think it's weirdly common to hire corporate investigators. Something that might have been done on rare occasions 10 or 15 years ago, I think has oddly become actually kind of normal.
This is fascinating. There are folks in this conversation. For example, Jim Bignall, who's with us today. Jim's really into improving the conduct of organisations and good cultures and that kind of thing. We've also got people here, Duncan, tonight, who, in all honesty, you could literally write a book from their stories. Honestly, you would not believe what some of these folks have been through. We've got people like Robert Delner here, who former very senior banking executive who was very close to some very serious whistleblowing that went on. Again, I think you're going to like hearing some of the narrative that some of these folks can share. I've got a couple more questions, if I may, Duncan. Then we'll kind of throw it open. So, um, I'm about to give an appalling explanation of the Lex Greensill business model. Right. I then want you to turn what I'm about to say, the gibberish rubbish I'm about to explain, into the reality. Okay, just to help people understand what the basic business model is. And all I'm about to say is simply based upon the news clippings I've seen here and there. But as I understand it, Lex promoted the idea that he had developed a technology that could be used to enable businesses to chase up payment on their invoices quicker and better. So they got more of the money owed into them more quickly, which meant that they could operate more efficiently as a business, and therefore it was cash generative. And that was um, useful in general terms, but because of the pandemic, it had particular applications. I think in like the pharmacist industry or something like that. I can't remember the detail, where the ability to kind of um, help a company, particularly a smaller company, to kind of have this kind of cash coming in quicker than it otherwise would, was a really cool thing. And in theory, it could help to kind of transform the way the whole credit finance system would work in smaller businesses. And it was kind of packaged as being this new paradigm, this efficiency enabler that was good for the world and good for everybody. And aren't we wonderful that we've created it? That's my rubbish explanation. Please turn that rubbish into something a bit more decent. So those here who don't know about the story um, know it a little bit more than they do now. Just explain the business model if you like. Thank you.
Yeah, that's not bad at all, but I'll try.
Okay.
So one thing I would say is the way Lex designed his business was deliberately complex. It was deliberately complex so that it was hard to unravel, and it is taking years for lawyers to unravel it. So let me step even further back. So there's
Yes.
a business that the banks have done forever called it comes under various different names. So let's call it supply chain finance. That's sort of what Lex does.
Right.
So that essentially involves, there's a let's say a big supermarket, and it wants to buy, produce from loaded little farms. The farm will send the produce, and the big supermarket will say, yeah, I'll pay you in a year's time. And that's not very good for anybody, really, right? Like, in fact, the farm might go out of business. Yeah, the supermarket gets to delay its payment, but that's not great if its supplier ends. So what the banks have done traditionally is they kind of insert themselves into the middle of that, and so they say, I'll pay the farmer on day one, and supermarket, you can pay me on day 90, or whatever it is, whenever your payment terms are, and I'll take a cut of the payment. So instead of the farmer getting £100, he gets £99, and the bank takes the pound. So that business has gone on forever. I mean, hundreds of years. It's sort of one of the earliest forms of banking in a way. And it does make very much money at all. There's not much margin in it. The banks tend to sort of do it as a favor to their big corporate clients. So Lex sort of added a couple of twists to this. He thought there was a way to do this that was like more efficient, more technological, and all that kind of stuff. But what he essentially did was he didn't have a bank, right? He didn't have a whole load of money. So what he did was he said, I'll set up a fund to invest in these supply chain finance loans. So I'll provide money to the farmer on day one, and I'll collect it from the bank on day 90. But that money, I'm going to get it by setting up a fund, and I'm going to get a bunch of institutional investors and others to put their money into it. So the idea being, the rationale for it there were many different rationales, but the one key one was that original supply chain finance business I talked about, during the financial crisis, a lot of banks had pulled back from it. And Lex's pitch was, look, if this is run by a fund with a whole bunch of different investors, they're less likely to all pull out at once. So it should keep the whole thing running more smoothly. So the problem with his business model is that there's not much margin. As I said at the start, there's just not much money to be made in this. So once you put a bunch of investors in, they want a return. Lex needs a return to grow his business. In reality, a lot of those big institutional investors couldn't invest in this sort of stuff because it wasn't investment grade, it wasn't high enough rated, it wasn't high enough quality. So he had to go out and get insurance to cover the possibility of default. And so the insurance companies needed to get paid. So now you've got this business that's like really small margin, not very profitable, and everybody's got to get a cut of it. So it just sort of doesn't work as a business model. Now, what he did then was, because he couldn't accept that it didn't work, essentially, he went out and said he did the business for, first of all, he promised returns that he couldn't deliver. Secondly, he went out to the big companies like Coca-Cola and Boeing, like huge companies, and did it for them at a loss. So, he's losing money on every one of these deals. And then to kind of, in order to get more money, in order for him to actually be profitable, there was a whole chunk of his business that had nothing to do with this at all. It was essentially just lending money to highly risky companies. So, and often like very close to him personally. So he loaned billions of dollars to a guy named Sanjeev Gupta, who many have heard of. He's the sort of, was at one point the savior of the British steel industry, now far from that. And Sanjeev had been an investor himself in Greensill Capital. He made a loan to his neighbor, in fact, more than his neighbor, a guy who lived on his land, for 20 odd million pounds of Credit Suisse's clients' money that went to this guy. There was a cousin of one of the Greensill directors who got something like 15 million pounds. There was just a whole load of, so essentially he's got this supply chain finance business, which is what he became known for, which has these big clients like Coca-Cola, but it's running at a loss. But it sort of buys him credibility. It gives you the idea that he's running billions of dollars of transactions. And then attached to it is another business, which is a loss-making business making dodgy loans to shady companies, many of them who are, connected to him in some very personal way. Sorry, it's complicated, as I said, but
that really is remarkable. I'm just about to put a question in the chat. I promise this is my last question before we open up. I've got so many buzzing around my mind because your comments are triggering up all sorts of thoughts here. I'm just about to put it in the chat. So do you think these folks, when I talk about these folks, I'm talking generally here, not just Greensill, but people who do dodgy things, people who are duplicitous, people who set out to deceive, people who cheat the system. I'm talking generically here. Um, do you think they somehow are able to insulate themselves from what their conscience should be saying to them? I don't know about you, Duncan, but if I do something wrong, I feel really quite guilty about it, and I'll lose sleep about it. It will literally worry me, or keep it will annoy me. I'll feel angry with myself. As a consequence, you don't do it. Are these people's got minds that are just wired up differently that somehow let them, if that's the right phrase, let them do wrong without feeling that they're doing wrong? Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think in Lex's case, first of all, I would say, I mean, this is follow on to what I just said, but answering your question, in Lex's case, I think he thoroughly believes that his business was a good one and that
Wow,
everyone else's fault that it's collapsed, right?
really?
Yeah, I think he thought, well, your point earlier at the start about what the difference between what's illegal and what's kind of, you
Yeah,
know, proper. I think he would say, in his view, nothing he did was illegal. I mean, I think we'll find that out over the next few years in various court cases. But I think his view would be that it wasn't illegal, that the documents, for instance, the Credit Suisse fund documents, right? So these funds are the ones that have invested $7 billion in Coca-Cola type stuff and $3 billion in stuff that's never going to be recovered. He would say that the fund documents said things like, these will be invested in, great quality companies. From time to time, we can also invest in other things, right?
right.
I'm paraphrasing obviously enormously there, but so
Yeah,
he would say, well, you know, I mean, like, well, everybody should have kept an eye out for that. But to me, clearly, to your point, I couldn't have slept at night knowing that, that was implying that I was dealing with these big, blue chip companies when in reality I was lending money to people who were nothing like that.
yeah,
I think, I think he I think he believes he was doing something good, or maybe he believed, well, I've got to cut some corners in the short term, but in the long term, I think I'll figure out a way to get rid of that stuff. I mean, I definitely heard on some of the Sanjeev Gupta loans, they were trying to get out of that business. The Lex's view, I think, was when businesses are this size and Sanjeev Gupta's this big, but when my business is this big, it won't matter as much, and we'll kind of we'll move on. So I think they were aware of problems. He was aware of problems.
yeah. So it's almost as if he might be, or people like that might be fabricating or engineering in their own mind an architecture that justifies what they're doing.
Yeah.
Um, and if necessary, they'll almost delude themselves into believing certain things to make that all stack up. Um, this is so fascinating, so fascinating. I'm gonna, if I may, I'm gonna invite Cormac Butler to very, very briefly introduce himself. Cormac is somebody we've got to know in recent months and really respect his view on a lot of things, particularly in relation to scandalous misconduct in Ireland. But Duncan, there's definitely a book in Cormac, I promise you. Really scandalous conduct in Ireland. Cormac, please do take a moment to introduce yourself to Duncan and everybody else, and elaborate on the point you made in the chat earlier about dodgy accounting and fraudulent accounting and that kind of thing. Thanks, Cormac. Thank you.
Duncan, thank you very much for your talk. And I'll talk a little bit about myself. I've been helping um, victims of banks in Ireland. These are, broadly speaking, they include shareholders, but they also include people who've borrowed money from banks. They're not legally in default, but the banks have declared them to be in default for a variety of reasons. And they've taken the opportunity to take over their assets at discounted prices and then sell them on at a huge profit. You've probably heard of the West Register scandal in the UK, and GRG and Ulster Bank and Royal Bank of Scotland. Well, we have that problem multiplied in Ireland, and the regulators are operating very slowly. I'll give you all an update in a few minutes as to what's going on there. But Duncan, my question to you is you may have been aware, you have an accounting background, that the accounting rules changed in or about 2005. Under the new rules, the then new rules, banks could conceal losses under the accounting standards, even though that was against the law. The accounting standard IAS 39 said that if you make a loan, you don't have to estimate the recoverable value. So if I give you a loan, or you might be Gupta and I give Gupta a loan, I know it's going to default. The auditors will say, well, that's not of concern to us. We just have to book the loan on the amount that you've advanced. And if it goes into default, it's not we don't measure it until the creditor admits, or rather the debtor admits that he's in difficulty. So there was a delayed recognition of losses, and between 2005 and 2018, between 2002 and 2008, many banks lent recklessly, knowing that they could still record a profit on these loss-making transactions and made a small fortune. The regulators never really did anything about it. We approached the regulators and they said it's the law, which is wrong, because the accounting profession developed these rules and they're not legislators. And that problem is still with us today. Do you think the Greensill problem could have been exposed a lot earlier if the regulators had done their job properly? And do you have any comment on these accounting standards? You probably are out of the profession, which is a good thing, but have you come across that particular problem with Greensill?
Hi, Cormac. So I think with Greensill, so what I would say is the Greensill funds wouldn't have that problem because they weren't the banks themselves loaning money. They were it was the funds, right? So they wouldn't be covered by that. Greensill, interestingly enough, we talk about the regulators in Greensill, it sort of fell into this black hole, again, by design, right? So Greensill's parent company was registered in Australia. The main operating company was registered in the UK, but it was registered with the FCA in a sort of, I've forgotten the name of the way they did it, but they did it that gave it a light touch regulation. They did it through a sort of like a shell business, essentially. The funds were registered in Liechtenstein and Luxembourg. He had a bank in Germany that reported to the German regulator. So he would argue, well, I'm regulated by everybody, but the reality was there was no lead regulator for Lex Greensill. There was nobody was in charge. Now that doesn't mean that, in my view, the regulators are off the hook, because, for instance, when GAM blew up, so GAM was regulated by the FCA. When GAM blew up, which was sort of a mini version of what Lex did at Credit Suisse, there was an investigation there. There was a whistleblower who'd given them incredible amount of information, very brave guy who sort of stood up, lost his job, lost his friendships, all of that stuff, the typical story. And but it had done it and sort of sacrificed himself to essentially wake everyone up to what was going on. The FCA got the report that GAM did. I know they got it. And I have that report too, or I've read that report. And so there is no way you could read that report and say, I'm okay with Greensill Capital. I mean, I've read it. It's like a damning report. And yet the FCA read it and said, well, we're not his primary regulator. So we're only interested in what happened at GAM. I would guess that's true, but it doesn't seem right. Like I would have thought that you have a responsibility as a sort of sophisticated financial regulator that if you come across wrongdoing, even if it's not, exactly in your purview, you surely have the responsibility to do something about it, especially when you see the exact same thing happening at Credit Suisse, but on steroids.
Yeah. Did Greensill, were they able to borrow money from the Bank of England or from the Treasury? I know they applied to borrow money from the Treasury. I know they were turned down, but did they borrow money from the Bank of England?
No, they were turned down at the Bank of England as
well. So their main source of funds were pure investors. There was no government funding.
But they did get government. So they got money from the British Business Bank, I think. But they got turned. I mean, that's another issue, right? They were turned down by the Bank of England, turned down by Treasury, and yet they still got money from the government. How can two government agencies say, no, we don't think it's right, and another one says, yeah, we're okay with it.
But I suppose that's why you have people like David Cameron on the board. He can smooth things over.
Precisely.
Yeah,
Cameron, I mean, it's staggering to me that he sold himself. I mean, look, the BBC, I think, has said he got paid £7 million. He's always denied it was £7 million. I suspect that's because it's more than £7 million. So you can sort of get away with saying it wasn't that. But to me, he sold his reputation. The only thing he had as a former prime minister really to sell is your reputation, right? He's not being employed for his sophisticated knowledge of supply chain finance or his understanding of fintechs. He's being employed because he is a door opener and he's got a name. And to sell that for, let's say it is 7 million, it seems like incredible, really. I'm not sure that that's a great trade, right? Like it shouldn't have been. I mean, it's remarkable that he's back in office.
And do we know whether David Cameron lobbied to actually raise funds for Greensill, or did he just lobby to have preferential regulatory treatment?
He went with them to like SoftBank when they got investor money there. He specifically went with them to their meetings with SoftBank, and I think helped that deal get over the line. He lobbied for them to get access, mostly though, to government funding. He wrote to something like 200 different corporations asking for them to work with Greensill. I mean, one of the things, again, comes back to something Andy said at the start. One of the things that I think Lex Greensill saw early on, because, and you probably know this either from my book or because you've read it in news stories, he managed to get into Downing Street early on. So in about 2011, 2012, he was appointed as a sort of advisor on supply chains. This was because he had known a former senior civil servant who'd known him at Morgan Stanley. And after the financial crisis, the government was looking at how do we get money into small businesses? And one of the things somebody had said was, we should do supply chain finance. And this guy who's a senior civil servant, Jeremy Haywood, said, well, I know a guy. And so Lex, being Lex, kind of, the door opens an inch and he sort of pushed it down. And he's suddenly holding meetings in Downing Street and printed his own Downing Street business card. Anyway, as a result, I think he sort of came to understand that there was a real value in tapping into flows of government money. That was the best source of money, much better than anything else. So you'll see him doing deals that are like, they did a deal in Scotland where he financed Sanjeev Gupta. I might get this the wrong way around, but Sanjeev Gupta's a company owned by Sanjeev Gupta's dad and a company owned by Sanjeev Gupta. One of them bought an aluminium smelter and one of them bought the power station that supplies the aluminium smelter. And they somehow persuaded the Scottish government to provide a guarantee on a loan from Lex Greensill to finance the whole thing, for which the Scottish government is on the hook still for tens of millions of pounds.
Is there any evidence that somebody like David Cameron should have been aware that the loans were overvalued? Obviously, Greensill were lending, and with a basic analysis, you would realize that they're not going to get their money back. Now, the first line of defense there is that the auditors, if they were doing their job, they should say, we have to put a provision against these loans because we're not going to get any of the money back. And that should appear in the accounts, and therefore David Cameron should be aware while lobbying that anyone who puts money into Greensill will not get it back.
So I would say he should have known. They were, and for several reasons. One, I know at least two senior politicians told him that don't do business with this guy. And then secondly, he was not a board member, right? So they deliberately gave him a role as a senior advisor or something like that. He was called senior advisor to the firm. He was an employee, which enabled him to get around the rules governing the sort of revolving door rules, where if he was a director, it would have been more problematic for him. But he was a senior advisor. However, I know for sure when they would have a monthly management meeting, the whole management and board is there, after which they have a board meeting, the management clears out, David Cameron stays. So he was essentially acting like a board member. so he was in meetings where, I know they were, because I've seen the documents, they were given all the information about the loans that were going wrong. The only thing I'd say about this, and I mean, I know exactly what was said in some of those meetings. Lex was pretty transparent actually about things going wrong, but in a very odd, convincing way if you're not paying any attention. So he would say things like, we got a bit of a problem with Sanjeev Gupta. He owes 3 billion, he's defaulted, but it's okay, I'll sort it all out. And everyone else would just sort of say, yeah, okay, on to the next agenda item.
Yeah.
And there was no attempt to value the loans to reflect these difficulties. None at all.
No, and in fact, it's worse than that actually, Cormac, because because these are all short-term loans, right? They're supposedly financing kind of people buying, steel for the steel mill or whatever it is. So they're supposedly like supply chain finance loans shouldn't be more than 180 days. On rare occasions they might be 9 months. Often they're 90 days. So what they would do is if somebody didn't pay, they would just make a new loan. They would just write another one.
Roll it over.
Yeah. So they'd never. So actually, we went to Credit Suisse and said to them exactly this point. Look, some of these loans are to companies that can't pay them back, and I can show you their accounts that will prove they can't pay them back. The portfolio managers at Credit Suisse would say things like, "But we haven't had any defaults." And I'd say, "Yeah, you haven't had any defaults because Lex has told you haven't had any defaults. It's not true that you haven't. He's just told you haven't. And so long as money keeps coming into these funds, he'll never have to tell you that those people didn't pay the money back."
That conversation, Cormac, thank you very much thank you very much indeed for your input. We'll go to Robert Delner in a minute. Robert, in a short while, would you please the theme of the role of the whistleblower, the man, the lady who stands up and speaks out despite the challenges and despite the risks. You knew Paul Moore very well. Would you mind, when I pass over to you in a moment, to speaking about Paul Moore and what he did, and what he was speaking up about? Because the theme that connects the Paul Moore experience with what we're talking about tonight is this idea of unbridled greed causing people to behave in a certain way. But just before we go there, another quick comment from myself, Duncan, if I may. I've been taking a lot of interest recently in things that are genuinely jeopardizing the quality of our democracy. Without getting into party politics stuff, there's a lot of concern on the other side of the Atlantic about what might happen as a consequence of the next election there. Could that lead to the undermining of democracy in the USA? There's growing concern here in the UK about the lack of transparency around party political donations. Even today, there was a piece of the news about somebody who said something completely nuts and completely and utterly wrong. And it was fascinating to see how, and I'm not making a party political comment here, it was fascinating to see how the Conservative Party's spokespeople kind of came to his defense, despite the fact that he said stuff that was indefensible. Is it a coincidence that they did that when he donated, I think, was it £10 million to the Conservative Party last year? Do you share my concerns, Duncan, that our democracy is not bulletproof and could be undermined and diluted if we allow this lack of standards and ethics in conduct in public life to continue? Because for me, that's the big story here. The evidence that influence can be bought. And that's a pretty shocking state of affairs. Duncan, what do you think on that? Then we'll go to Robert. Thank you.
I mean, I think, look, it's obviously difficult to talk about some of it because it is in front of courts and,
yes, of course. Yeah.
Guilty of anything yet. But I would say that it's not good for a democracy like ours if people get away with influencing politicians because they fly them around on their private jets, or make sure they put £7 million in their pocket by look, I mean, Lex Greensill got an MBE, I think, from under David Cameron, and then David Cameron goes to work for Lex Greensill, gets paid. You know, the MBE helps Lex around the world. Cameron then, you know, gets paid really well. It doesn't feel very good at all, right? And if we saw that in a developing world country, we'd sort of shrug our shoulders and think, well, that's what you expect to see there. I think, you know, it felt like to me at certain stages, Lex was very aware of the amount of government money flowing around and that he could tap that. And that again, you know, it doesn't feel right. So he really wanted to get involved in the NHS and tried. In part because he realized if he could become a big supplier to the NHS, then he was like unstoppable.
Mm-hmm.
You know, couldn't let a company go bankrupt if it managed all the NHS's payroll or its supplier payments. And
yeah,
feels like something that happens in other countries.
Now that you mention the NHS, I must admit to having a dark thought earlier today when I was listening to the news this morning. There was an off-the-cuff remark in the news coverage about the gentleman who said what he shouldn't have said that was totally wrong. It was something about he made a lot of money through selling software for the NHS. And I just imagined, I'm not accusing anybody of anything here, but I'm just imagining the kind of relationship that would exist if a business person is making a fortune selling software to the NHS, yeah, big government procurement stuff, right? And that person then goes on to become a major donor to the political party in charge of the government at the time. You know, the optics could look a bit shady, couldn't they? I'm not suggesting they are, but they could. And I'm not looking to draw you on that, Duncan. What I am going to do is to go to Robert. Robert's a great fan of TTF. It's lovely having him at this event. Robert, could you please take a moment just to introduce yourself and give everybody an understanding of your kind of senior former banker perspective on this? Perhaps talk about Paul more briefly, and of course, share any thoughts you have on Duncan and what he said in his book. Thanks, Robert. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Andy, and thank you very much, Duncan. It's very interesting to hear. In my career and background, I worked for a number of organizations, Citigroup, BNP Paribas, etc., as an investment banker, if I can call it that. I mean, I saw and witnessed quite a lot of activities which, you know, either were under the radar or would be deemed to be, let's say, not necessarily what would be expected inside these organizations. So I sort of empathize with a lot of what you have to say. So turning to Paul Moore briefly, I think most people will know Paul Moore's story very well, so I'm not going to go into detail on that. However, I think what you mentioned, Duncan, as well, was that, you know, the notion that a whistleblower who effectively puts their reputation, life, future on the line, risks a lot, really, for everyone else's benefits, is treated the way they're treated in the UK is obviously appalling. And there's lots of reasons for that, maybe, possibly, but none of them are good. And in Paul's case, it did not end well. He passed away a couple of years ago. And I think, you know, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of whistleblowers now who make that very courageous step. But they're still treated like pariahs in the industries that they're working with and all the consequences that come thereof. So I think, you know, I guess the comment I would make is that why is this? What is it now in the culture that we live in where this is actually allowed? And I think Stephen mentioned earlier in the comment there that, you know, maybe Greensill was a narcissist, and it's very likely that he was. There's been quite a lot written actually about, you know, psychopaths in the boardroom and so forth. that we are now entering maybe a stage, both in the economy, but also in the financial community, where leadership is not necessarily just on merit and a high moral compass, etc. But if anything, there are now tendencies maybe to become extremely egocentric, and on the point maybe of narcissism, psychopathy, sociopathy, etc. It seems to be, and that is also a bit my experience, that it has been an attribute of some of the leaders I've been working with in these banks, that they've actually had those sort of tendencies. So again, I'm not suggesting that Grenzel was that way inclined, but if you sort of start joining the dots in terms of behavior, and more importantly, the way that this is now accepted within our society and our culture, we live, as we know, in this sort of post-truth world, and maybe that also has a lot to do with that. This has now become sort of more normalized. We've seen so many scandals, whether it's the COVID PPE, post office, you name it, and somehow it's becoming the new normal, that this is sort of the way organizations, legislators, regulators kind of behave. So that would be sort of a core concern, why it's unlikely that, I would say, things will improve until such time that you sort of look at the root cause of this, and a lot of it has to do with the quality of the leadership that we have in across industry and politics, etc. And I think I just leave it there, because I'm sure there's hundreds and hundreds of ways we could extend that conversation. But also, Andy, I would like to thank you. I'm going to have to leave very shortly, so if I do, then I'll thank you all for your time, and thanks for sharing.
Robert, thanks for your input today. And just like I've got the ceiling envy for Nigel Cairns' ceiling, I've always got envy of Robert's room. His background looks like it's one of those virtual backgrounds. You get like an idyllic library type thing. Those are actual real books and a real lovely room. I know that for a fact. Robert, thanks for your input. Thank you very much. I'm really keen to get other people's thoughts on this. I'm keen, for example, to get Jim Bignell's comments, because Jim's got a really good perspective on things like organizational culture and cultural design, and what is it that drives people to behave the way that they do, and that sort of stuff. And perhaps also Peter Hall. Peter's somebody we've only known at TTF for a few months, and Peter's doing some outstanding work trying to expose some pretty heavy-duty fraud that's been going on out there. So perhaps Peter will speak to his thoughts in a moment as well. But could I first of all just go to Nigel Cairns? Nigel's a superb ambassador for the TTF and volunteer, does a hell of a lot of work and support in various ways. Nigel, I know what we've been discussing tonight will be of interest to you, and you can relate to much of it from the life experience you've got. What's front of mind for you when thinking about Duncan and his book? Thanks, Nigel.
Well, I had to have a bit of a smile to myself, because a number of years ago now, I was also followed by private detectives who turned out to be ex-metropolitan policemen, poachers come gamekeepers. And I was very fortunate in many ways, because I was able to find out the names of these private detectives, and right back to where they actually lived, and who was employing them, which was a FTSE 100 company. And the company dropped their services like a hot potato, as you could imagine, after that. But we actually managed to get footage and interviewed them, because they turned up at my premises and were very interested in a meeting that was going on, and we called the police and managed to get them moved on under threat of a breach of the police. and they left under a cheer of about 40 or 50 supposedly very angry people that were about to duff them up. I don't think they actually would have done. I think we were more amazed than anything else. But yeah, you know, these things are going on all the time, actually, you know, and I think it must be fairly common currency for a lot of big companies to routinely, you know, obviously at arm's length, engage in these sorts of activities. It's not just on films at all.
Wow. Horrific.
So, no, in actual fact, you know, perhaps I should have felt it was a bit more sinister, the whole thing, but I was hugely amused by it all, in fact. And I've never come to any direct harm that I know about through those incidences anyway.
Nigel, I don't know if you feel like this, but I still feel like when I say it, I find it hard to believe it's true. It's sort of so bizarre, such a strange thing to happen.
No, absolutely, and especially because, you know, we had the opportunity to try and interview these two private detectives and ask them what they were doing there, and they said that it was their hobby to sit in, you know, a lay-by outside somebody's premises and what have you. So, you know, we were able to question them on the unusual nature of their hobbies and things like this, just making really complete twits of them.
Yeah.
And I've still got the tapes.
Fascinating stuff.
Maybe they'll come out one day, but I know that's not an answer exactly to what you asked me, Andy, but I couldn't resist sharing them.
No, that's good. That's really, really nice. I'm going to invite, if you'd like to, I'm going to invite comment from Jim Bignell about the kind of, let me put it to you like this as a question, Jim. So you know a lot about organizational design and culture and organizations and that kind of thing. What do you think has to be going on in an organization for it to behave in the kind of way it seems that the Greensill organization was behaving? Can you shine any light on that from a kind of cultural and organizational design point of view?
I wish I could, Andy, actually. Duncan, thanks very much for your contribution. It's very interesting. The interesting thing I'd like to know, and maybe Duncan can shed some light on it, is how many people did Greensill employ, and also would they have been aware of the malfeasance that was going on? Because my feeling that maybe at some stage we should be thinking about how to resolve these problems in the long term, and my feeling is that the majority of people who work for these organisations are in fact very honest and have integrity, and I feel we should try and empower them. If what I said is correct, empower them to say no, we cannot continue with this sort of behaviour. I think the future trying to resolve these problems lies really in employees, on the good employees, who I think represent the majority of the totality of people working for the organisation. So, I mean, Duncan, would you know how many they employed, and you know would they have been aware of what was going on?
So at the end, they had about 1,000 employees. They grew pretty fast. So within that, grew from about 400 a year and a half earlier to about 1,000. You know, which is obviously a sign of a company that isn't quite not acting normally. And I think a dozen maybe had some inkling of what was really going on, and I think it was probably 3 or 4 that knew exactly what was going on. So I think it was very few people. So to your point, you know, most people were just trying to get on and do their jobs. You know, I would say 75-80% of them were working on the stuff that actually wasn't making any money, but they didn't know that. There's a lot of people there doing things, despite, you know, Lex, earlier on, I think, Andy, you mentioned the technology. Despite Lex's claims to having some like amazing new technology, actually they were just putting numbers into Excel spreadsheets. And so there were a lot of people there who were just putting numbers into Excel. But yeah, I think there were probably a handful of people who found out things weren't right or had suspicions things weren't right, who may have been able to do something about it. For the most part, they were shunned, really, inside Greensill. So there was a chief risk officer who left about a year before it blew up. And my understanding is he probably knew things were wrong and fell out with Lex over it. And there were a couple of others who had little bits of information. I think it was actually held really tight. You know, the real truth was really tight. I think at Credit Suisse, there were definitely people who knew things weren't right, but didn't necessarily say or didn't feel like it were, you know, they did that thing of going, oh, well, let's just ignore it. You know, let's just steer clear. There were definitely people who worked at insurance companies who'd come across Lex Greensill and thought he was, you know, writing contracts that didn't make sense, didn't do anything about it, just didn't work with him. Very, very few people who came across him and said, I'm going to try and stop this. And, you know, I like to Andy's point at the start, I don't know if I would have tried to stop it. You know, so sort of my position meant it was, as a journalist, that's kind of my role. But if I'd worked in the company, would I have had the nerve to go and say, let's do this anymore? I'm not sure.
That's fascinating. Several times in this conversation tonight, Duncan, I've thought about the Madoff scandal. It seems like with the Madoff scandal, there was a very small number of people who actually really knew what was going on, a very, very small number, but none of them did the right thing and speak out in any way. They were in some way aligned with the charade that was going on, if that's the right word. Did you come across anybody that you'd think of as being a bit heroic here in terms of somebody who really went out of their way to do the right thing and helped to kind of expose what was going on? Are there any real heroes here?
The guy at GAM, the whistleblower at GAM, who, I mean, he sort of, you know, he had a classic whistleblower story. So he was the co-portfolio manager at GAM with two guys running an £11 billion fund. The whistleblower guy was probably the quieter, more studious guy. The other co-portfolio manager was the flamboyant guy around the city. Every journalist in London knew him. And he kind of just became really attached to Lex. And all of a sudden, they were investing loads of money into Greensill stuff. The studious guy said, hang on a minute, who's this guy? Where's this money going? I don't understand it. Why are we putting so much in? And actually, what's really interesting, thinking about how cultures and organizations respond, is what happened there, I think, because, you know, essentially, they started off with a few £1 million into Greensill assets, into loans Greensill had made. And I think initially the whistleblower raises his hand. There's sort of emails I've seen where he sort of says, hang on a minute, not sure I understand this. Why are we doing this? And everybody, you know, they're managing an £11 billion fund. And so everybody kind of get the emails bounce back and forwards a bit. And then everybody sort of says, let's just move on. It's it's £5 million in £11 billion fund. You know, then a month later, it's £10 million. Same thing happens again. You know, this goes on until a year later, it's £1 billion, right? The problem, I think, then, I've thought about this a lot, like psychologically, what's happening there. I think a lot of them, by the time it's £1 billion, actually realize something is wrong, but they've said there's nothing wrong all the way along. And so it's really difficult at that point to turn around for any of them and say, oh, I was wrong for the last 12 months. You know, you should have ignored me. I'm now on the side of the whistleblower. And they just don't do it. You know, they try and figure out, oh, well, how can we sort of make this seem like it's right?
That's really fascinating. We can relate that big time. There's no time to go into detail here, but we are absolutely convinced that the Financial Conduct Authority, when it gets things wrong, rather than saying we got it wrong, it creates a false narrative to defend its position that it wasn't wrong, it was actually right. And then it just continues to dig that hole forever and ever, amen. And it's caused so many problems because it's resulted in a regulator that doesn't regulate, but spends time, and these are my words, not yours, Duncan, don't worry. We have a regulator that spends time and energy trying to obfuscate on covering up the truth rather than actually doing what needs to be done. This makes me think of the airline industry because, as I understand it, when things go horribly wrong in the airline industry, you know, if a plane comes down, they keep working out why it came down until they find out specifically why it came down, and then they engineer the planes in the future so that that particular mistake literally cannot happen again. They don't have a blame culture. They have let's sort out what went wrong, folks, and let's put it right for the future. It seems like in the world of commerce, particularly in the world of financial services, there is no appetite for people to be able to kind of put their hands up and say, I got it wrong. I want to move on from here. I can see Nigel's itching to come in, then Stephen. Nigel, just quickly, then to Stephen. Thank you.
Just a quick point.
Yeah.
Can't help sort of commenting on the fact that there seems to be an obvious corollary. You mentioned the FCA with the very tight concentration of power of the real decision makers within the organisation, and how it's possible that there's like an organisation within an organisation, and there may be many good people outside of that tight circle that aren't really aware or don't have access to influence of the big decisions that are going on, and certainly the surreptitious ones. And also similarly maybe with the big banks, where maybe the whole of the board doesn't even know what's going on half the time.
Thank you very much indeed, Nigel. We'll go to Steve and then we'll jump back to Duncan and open up for everyone else as well. Stephen.
Some of the problems in the financial world that we've experienced and witnessed, I think there's two factors I would say, is that we lost the culture in the 1980s of people being in those institutions for life. In other words, we got to a position where moving around institutions was considered good. In fact, you lacked ambition if you didn't move. But there were still some long-serving people who didn't move because they didn't wish to have the challenge of a new organisation, because they were already, shall we say, busily doing things in the organisation in which they were located that they couldn't really leave behind and stay within the sector. I think the other point I would make is that when you have a concept of independence or an independent organisation, you have to make sure it is independent. And sometimes that means that the people within it at certain levels or doing certain things cannot do that for anybody that they are supervising or regulating or policing. You can use different words, but it means the same thing. They can't be flip-flopping between one and the other. And if that means you have to reward those people well by comparison with other organizations, then you have to reward them well. I think we have a lot to learn from America. I've been involved with a couple of situations involving what we would call local government. And it's well known in America that every now and then you just have to have the FBI come in and do a clean sweep. And lots of local officials are arrested, charged for all sorts of things. It does not even rate a comment in the national news or national press, and only features in the local press. But it's kind of accepted. If you leave them alone, they will be up to all sorts of things. So we have to culturally come round to the idea that our financial services sector needs a clean sweep every now and then. But who's going to deliver it? It's not the current regulator. As it's constituted and how it's connected, no, completely useless, and has been for many years. It's not recent. It's been going on probably almost since it was founded in 1985. They just keep changing the name. So as you don't realize it's the same body. 1985. And it's still going.
Stephen, thank you very much. I'm going to make a few points, then pass over to anybody else who's itching to make a point in terms of any other business. I'll then go to Duncan for his final comments, and then we'll wrap up at roughly 7:30. Duncan, you may or may not be aware of a database I'm going to briefly share with you now, if I can do so, because you mentioned Credit Suisse, and Credit Suisse is an organization that comes up time and time again in our world. And you mentioned the book you're writing or thinking about writing in relation to Credit Suisse. So what you're looking at now, folks, and I know some of you know this already, Duncan may not be aware of it. So there's a database called Violation Tracker. As its name suggests, it tracks violations. This is the USA version. There's also a UK version. What you can do is put the company name here in the chat, sorry, in the box. You click it, and then you get the violations history of that particular organization. So what you've got here, Duncan, is 59 violations by Credit Suisse, and it's really good. I mean, it's really good data, and it's ranked according to how big the fine is. So there's fines here for toxic securities abuses, fines for tax violations, fines for investor protection violations, economic sanction violations, etc., etc., etc. And if you want to get into the detail of each one, you can. You click on here, penalty amount, and it will tell you the narrative about that particular situation. And it will always take you to the source of the data. Journalists love this because it's very credible data. Because if you click on where it's a source of data, click here, it'll take you to the official documentation that was used to populate the database, which is, it's perfect from a researching point of view. I think you'll really like that. I'll introduce you to the folks that run this violation tracker database. You might find it quite useful to reference some of the data in here. There's also a couple of other organizations we know that might be of use to you moving forward. And again, I'll introduce you to those folk in due course, Duncan. So just before we go to Duncan for his kind of final comments and any further reflections, can I invite anybody that hasn't yet had a chance to contribute to the conversation to do so? Would Isabella or Peter Hall or anybody else want to come in? If you do, please do. Sue or anybody. I just want to make sure I'm politely giving everybody a chance to chip in if they'd like to. In which case, I think we're very much in the home straight. Duncan, your chance for final comments before we wrap the session up. And thank you again from all of us for sharing your time tonight and telling us about your book and your insights. Over to you, Duncan, for any final thoughts you'd like to share. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thanks again, everybody. It's just one point in the last comments that I thought were interesting. Another thing that I think has changed since the 80s and even the 90s is in banking is the amount of compensation available, right? So the pay that is available to bankers now is so disproportionate to what is available to other people that actually it makes it the incentive is to make as much money as fast as you can and get out. So you can earn in 3 or 4 years multiples of what a lottery winner gets. Why wouldn't you push the boundaries and see if you can get out quickly? I think that's a major factor in my view as to why things have gone wrong. The other thing one other point I'd like to make, which is one of the things I found when Greensill finally collapsed, I did get a call from Credit Suisse finally kind of saying, oh, you were right. We're going to talk to you and tell you everything, right? First day, I'm going to speak to the CEO, the chairman, everybody's going to want to talk. Within a week, that mood shifted dramatically. And after that, they didn't want to talk at all. In fact, they did a report. They got some external people to look into it, and they buried it. I know now, even the very senior executives didn't get a copy of the report. They got to see it on a laptop, and then it was taken away from them. And what's interesting about it to me is that their incentive, we talked a lot about incentives, their incentive suddenly shifted from let's get to the bottom of this, let's reveal the truth and make sure it never happens again, to we don't want to tell anybody about it because what we need is to try and get the cash. And to some degree, I can sort of see that there's a dilemma there, right? That they've lost 3 billion or more of their clients' money, and that if they come out into the world and tell us exactly what they've done wrong, they'll never get it back. The problem is they use that legal piece. They use the idea that they're trying to recover the money as a sort of reason never to tell us what really happened. And that just allows the behavior to continue over and over and over again. I found out, for instance, which without taking us on too long, in the last few days, that one of the loans to a Greensill company, 20 odd million pounds, Credit Suisse's clients' money went to one of Greensill's close associates. Just a few months ago, Credit Suisse and the administrators for Greensill Capital wrote off that debt because the Greensill associate paid them £4 million or thereabouts. Numbers might be slightly wrong, but they're close enough. So they wrote off £20 million because the guy gave them 4, and the 4 I'm pretty sure came from Greensill. So how is that possibly okay? I just don't understand how that sort of thing.
Yeah. The optics don't quite look right. That doesn't kind of smell right, does it? Duncan, it's been such a fascinating journey into your insights. We're very, very grateful for you taking time to tell us about your book and what you've learned. I'm going to end with one final question, if I may, Duncan. So, surely there's got to be a documentary or a drama in this somewhere. I mean, the people involved, the status of the people involved, the size of the story, the pandemic dimension, the dodgy finance dimension, the international dimension, the whistleblowers dimension, the human stories are there, aren't there? Is there any chance that this could be made into some kind of documentary or drama?
Yeah, so there is, somebody has bought the rights to make it into a drama, and they've written a screenplay, I think, or they've written.
Wow.
They're sort of out there talking to various potential producers. So hopefully it'll have the same sort of impact as some of the others have had recently.
Yeah.
Because I think it is a scandal that kind of came and went pretty quickly. And, reality is some very bad things happened, I think.
Well, that would be fantastic. Congratulations on your book, Duncan. Congratulations on the possibilities of what it's created for the future. We all salute your work, sir, and thank you very much indeed for being with us tonight. I'm sure everybody wants to show our appreciation again. Okay, well, almost mysteriously on time, we've wrapped up at 7:30. Thanks, folks. Have a great rest of your evening. Cheers, Duncan. I'll follow up with a couple of thoughts about other people to connect you to that might be useful to you in the future, okay? And I'll fix up some Zoom meetings, etc. Thanks, guys. Thanks all.